please. Thank you very much. I first want to thank Mr. Valeriot Frank for inviting me to speak at this town hall meeting on the issue of the ethics of assisted suicide, which clearly we're all here for a reason. I feel that it's really probably one of the critical issues, healthcare issues, social issues that we're facing today and will for a number of years. I will focus my comments primarily on my area of expertise, focusing on the study and prevention of suicide, primarily among older adults and other high-risk groups, and talk about the issue of suicide prevention and its overlap with assisted suicide, sharing some research findings and thoughts along the way. According to, and I should say, I know you're never supposed to start a presentation with an apology, but this is probably the first town hall meeting I've given, so I apologize if it's a little too academic, but we'll have the opportunity for dialogue afterwards. According to the World Health Organization, nearly 1 million people worldwide die by suicide every year. According to Statistics Canada, nearly 4,000 Canadians take their lives every year. But we know that these figures underestimate the true number of people who take their lives. We often fail to count those whose deaths employ more equivocal means, less obvious means, and those who refuse life-sustaining care. We know that suicide affects everybody, but not equally. Older adults have among the highest suicide rates of any age group worldwide, that's true in Canada as well, and are more likely to younger people to succumb to self-injury. This is of critical importance these days as the population of older adults is growing rapidly. Within the next 20 years, 1 in every 4 or 5 Canadians will be over 65, which is unprecedented in our history, which is why we need to understand more about issues associated with health promotion, mental health promotion, and treatment of the variety of conditions that might lead people to contemplate ending their lives. Researchers have identified a common set of risk factors associated with death by suicide, including have a history of suicidal thoughts or suicide ideation, suicidal behavior or suicide attempts, presence of a mental disorder like depression, anxiety, psychosis, and other disorders, physical illness, functional impairment, and a variety of life challenges, transitions, changes, losses, etc. It is a common myth that suicide in later life is primarily associated with having a terminal illness. That's simply not true. U.S. researchers found that although 30 to 40% of older adults who took their lives had some health problem, many of us have some health problem, only 2 to 3% who took their lives were terminally ill, suggesting 97 or 98% of older adults who ended their life were not terminally ill. So, that having been said, although the lay belief, and family members and others have said to me, well, this is clearly what you study, although the lay belief that most suicidal older adults are terminally ill is not correct, it is true that receiving a terminal prognosis, being told by your doctor on that fateful day that you have an illness that will take your life, can be psychologically overwhelming and can induce thoughts of suicide momentarily. For the majority of people who have these thoughts, in that context, the thoughts are reduced or go away within hours to days. However, for some, they linger, and for some, they grow and they remain, and it becomes an issue that they continue to pursue over time. Now, those who do contemplate these issues and start pursuing the issues are potentially at risk for a variety of issues, obviously including ending their life. Research findings, however, show that psychological interventions can enhance meaning in life, can enhance psychological well-being, and reduce or end thoughts of suicide in people so disposed. Those expressing thoughts of suicide in the context of severe emotional distress typically will elicit aggressive intervention from healthcare providers. But those expressing a wish to hasten death in the context of terminal illness often don't elicit that sort of reaction from providers, especially if the providers feel that it's understandable. If I was in that person's shoes, I too would want to die. What right do I have to ask somebody to continue to live under these circumstances? And so as a result, people who sometimes will express the thought that life is overwhelming, they can't see going on with this, which frankly is a thought. It's an expression of a thought. It can be an expression of momentary exacerbation of reaching out for support, for kindness, for sensitivity. Sometimes find they don't get that because people feel that they really have no right to intervene. Surely this must be somebody's right to do so. And in fact, some don't get the care they need, and some are aided in dying, even sometimes against their will. This is a problem in critical need of a solution, I feel, given the rapidly expanding older adult population and, again, the presence of effective interventions, certainly for the despair that can lead people to contemplate ending life. Research supports suicide risk detection, mental health interventions in reducing or ending suicidal thoughts, and meaning-centered and dignity-based psychotherapies and other mental health interventions in reducing and resolving depression, the wish to hasten death, and thoughts of suicide. A few years ago, while involved and vice president of the Canadian Association for Suicide Prevention, I was asked to contribute to a press release that group was writing when Francine Lalonde had put forward her bill. I think it was then her third attempt to legalize assisted suicide and euthanasia in Canada, but not solely for the terminally ill, but also for those with mental disorders, which raises a whole other set of issues and potentially slippery slope. The bill failed, all have at the federal level, but that's not really the point. The point was that in writing the release, I felt that rather than simply focusing or primarily focusing on the heart, on sharing philosophical perspectives, heartfelt beliefs, and even very important and touching personal examples that we have, I felt it was important to look at what we learned from the experiences of others, and important to learn at what researchers had to say about it. So I briefly reviewed findings from Oregon, which was the first state in the U.S. that legalized physician-assisted suicide under specific conditions, and from the Netherlands, where assisted suicide wasn't technically legal at the time, but tolerated under the law, and found that many of the same factors that I was very familiar with in my research on suicide prevention was associated with people wishing to end life at the end of life. Findings from Oregon suggested that there are a variety of psychological factors that impact the wish to hasten death, which is the term that's typically used for ending one's life in this context, that many people who requested assisted suicide from their physician did so more out of a feared loss of autonomy and control of bodily functions and a reported inability to enjoy life due to health problems more than out of fear of intractable pain. Anticipating becoming dependent on others or burdensome on others, the wish to end physical discomfort, pain, and suffering, to avoid prolonging death, and to control the circumstances of one's death were also associated with the decision to end life, as was the perception that life no longer held meaning. Similar findings emerged from Oregon. Overall, a growing body of research has identified a common set of psychological, social, and medical correlates of the wish to end life, including having a previous history of suicidal behavior, having a previous history of mental health care, being depressed, feeling hopeless, feeling anxious, and having certain rigid personality traits, like being, and these are some terms that have come out of the literature of people very supportive of assisted dying: inflexible, stubborn, strong-willed, fearing a loss of control, perceiving a threat to one's integrity or a loss of self, and there are a variety of other correlates. In reviewing the literature, it dawned on me, it became clear that similar to the situation among non-terminally ill people who contemplate suicide, those doing so in the context of a terminal illness tend to be more likely to have what I'd describe as an excessive need or a strong need for perceived autonomy or control. Although some have argued, more on emotional than empirical grounds for my opinion, that the, quote, slippery slope argument, that if you start allowing one group access to assisted suicide or assisted dying, then you're going to open the floodgates. Some have argued that's a myth. Data from Oregon, where they have a state office designed to actually collect information on every request that comes through a physician for assisted suicide, the physician's responses, whether they grant or don't grant that request, whether they provide a prescription or not, and whether the person died or not, showed that over the years in which this has been legal, and the Oregon legislation, incidentally, is called the Death with Dignity Act, and I'll touch very briefly on language in a moment, they found that the numbers requesting it increased. The numbers who were sent by their physicians for a psychological evaluation, as was recommended, though not required by law, for those where there was suspicion of depression or other mental disorder, decreased. In fact, the 2010 data, and you really can't access the data very, very easily, but this was from a psychiatrist in Oregon involved in the case in BC last year, of something like 95 or 97 people who requested or may have been offered assisted suicide, 2 were sent to a psychiatrist or psychologist. The numbers had been much higher in earlier years. I'm not convinced that physicians who had seen these people got better at assessing psychopathology, but rather maybe more comfortable with moving through this. So this is a concern. I think one concern that people share and that came out of the decision in BC last year is about people with depression or other mental disorders who request assisted dying. Clearly that's an issue, but in many ways I think people are aware of that. We tend to know that depression affects people's ability to think clearly. It tends to make people think of things in a more hopeless, pessimistic manner. Cognitive research has shown that people aren't as easily able to see options and choices ahead of them, which is why providing yet another option, the option to kill oneself legally with the assistance of another, might be something that's particularly attractive to people in that mindset and potentially dangerously so. But because people are aware of that impact of depression, I don't think we have to bring it to people's attention as much. One issue that really wasn't picked up quite as much is that of the personality characteristics and attitudes that lead certain people to be more likely to request assisted dying in the context of challenging life circumstances, whether those are financial, interpersonal, legal, residential, emotional, spiritual, and, yes, physical, including terminal illness. So it's my sense especially that that's especially the case when that trait, the need for extreme autonomy and control, seems to have become a bit of a cultural blind spot in Western civilization. We tend to conflate our worth or value as human beings with our marketplace value, with our ability to make money, to sort of serve as a cog in the machine. From that perspective, the old, the retired, and the disabled aren't seen to contribute, and so might be considered to be extraneous. Moreover, if we can't even care for ourselves and end up adding burden to others, we begin to think that others would be better off without us. As a society, we tend to send people that message. By advocating for assisted suicide, a message is being sent to the socially disadvantaged, the infirm, the weak, the old, or otherwise marginalized members of society, that they might consider removing themselves from it. A few final points to keep in mind. It's my sense, and all of the comments are my opinion and my read of the literature, it's my sense that a lot of the discussion that we hear about the rights of the terminally ill to live or die with dignity tend not to come from the terminally ill. Obviously, sometimes they do. But rather often from relatively healthy, middle-aged people who appear to have great difficulty conceptualizing physical or mental decline with aging, or rather with disease that sometimes accompanies aging. It's also worth noting that we typically aren't very good at guessing at what our mindset is going to be under certain conditions. So people will say, if that happens to me, kill me. But then if it actually happens to them, they're likely to say, now hold on just a second, life ain't so bad. We actually have the great ability to adapt to a lot. We also have to bear in mind that if the option of requesting physician-assisted suicide is made available to the terminally ill, most do not actually choose to end life or request aid in dying. And those who do request a lethal prescription, many never fill it or use it to hasten death. So recently when I saw CBC really covered about an hour-long show on Gloria Wilson, who was the woman involved in the case in BC with ALS, I wasn't shocked at all, but sort of surprised to see that CBC, I think it was CBC, sat on this information for a while, very clearly on TV, she said, I don't want to die. I want to live, but I want the option. But of course, that sense of that she didn't want to die really had never come out in the public, to my knowledge, before. So, despite the fact that only 2% of the 135,000 people who die in the Netherlands use assisted suicide, members of the public seem to believe, or are led to believe, that having a terminal illness warrants the option of killing oneself or of pursuing hastened death, sending a clear message to consider ending life when no longer capable of caring for oneself, or, yes, clearly, when suffering from intractable and severe pain, mental and physical. And let's be clear, one of the subtle ways in which that message is being sent is by shifting terminology. By changing the term assisted suicide to assisted dying, proponents are attempting to distance the issue from that of suicide, and in so doing to attempt to remove its associated stigma, associated connection with depression and other mental disorders, and to gain broader acceptance. As these complex ethical issues continue to be debated, or in fact are just starting to be debated, and it's wonderful that we have the opportunity for discussion tonight, clinicians and others are increasingly called upon to address a full range of end-of-life care issues, including providing competent and sensitive patient-centered care, ameliorating pain and suffering, and enhancing quality of life. And I'd argue that this is exactly what clinicians should be doing. We're trained to do, and in fact have a responsibility to do. Focus on enhancing treatment at the end of life and palliating pain and suffering, not focusing on ending life. So I thank you.